All right, Jay, we're back with Teacher Talk. It's good to meet up with you again. We're going right through the summer, it looks like here. Previous years, we've cut, just like teachers, we only like to really work 10 months a year. And
It's
then
the best part-time job around.
it is.
I just aggravated every teacher that might be listening to this.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm
And
clearly being facetious.
I always tell my friends who have adult jobs,
Right.
year-round jobs, like, yes, somehow this counts as an adult job, but I'm
Yep.
out. I'm out for 10 weeks now. So very nice. It's almost mid-June. What is it? Yeah, it's the 11th of June, and we're well into summer break, but we're continuing on with the Romantic movement, which I'm enjoying reading some G.K. Chesterton on the post-Romantic movement right now, the Victorians, very interesting, and gives some placement and perspective to it. But today's episode, we want to cover a pretty famous poem, Ozymandias, by Percy Shelley, a second generation Romantic after the generation of Coleridge and Wordsworth, who we've already covered a little bit, and representative of a time that, I don't know, probably is the most famous, or maybe the most emulated or desired to be emulated, era of Romantics. I don't know if that's true or not.
Yeah.
But probably so. I think the Shelley generation, the Shelley and Byron generation, felt that the Coleridge and the Wordsworth sort of, I don't know, like gave up or gave over, or it was sort of like Ben and Jerry, in the 60s. They were one thing, and then in the 90s, they were millionaires, and just completely changed. It kind of feels like that a little bit too.
I'm now thinking of like Romantic poetry inspired names for Ben and Jerry's flavors.
Yeah, there probably are some.
If anybody's listening to this, I would like people's ideas about Ben and Jerry flavors of ice cream for romantic poems or poets.
Yeah,
and extra credit if you get a good one. Yeah.
So anyway, we are on to the later Romantics with Percy Shelley and that great poem of his, Ozymandias. But before we read that, we got to start with a poem. We always start with a poem, whether we're doing poems or not. And Jay, you're that person. What do you have for us?
I really fell in love years ago with Jane Kenyon's poetry. She married Donald Hall, who's a great American poet who died a little more recently. Jane Kenyon died of cancer, I think, in the 2000s, like 2005. A really strong poet. And they ended up married, and they wrote a lot of poetry together. And this is one of Jane Kenyon's two most famous, most anthologized poems. And I find it to be a romantic poem that spiritually is a lot more optimistic than anything Shelley is capable of. I don't think Jane Kenyon would compare herself at all to Shelley. But I think the way she uses nature in this poem is spiritually related to how Shelley uses in Ozymandias, but only very quickly. Like they veer off apart from each other. So this is her poem, Let Evening Come. And again, she wrote it, I think she published it in 1990. She died of cancer years later. And Donald Hall wrote he has a book of poetry called Without, and a companion book with that. Any of C.S. Lewis's either Problem of Pain or A Grief Observed. You and I were talking about C.S. Lewis earlier. Just such incredibly honest poetic reflections about grief that avoid cliche in an amazing way. So this is Jane Kenyon's very famous poem, Let Evening Come. I really like it.
All right.
Let evening come. Let the light of late afternoon shine through chinks in the barn, moving up the bales as the sun moves down. Let the cricket take up chafing as a woman takes up her needles and her yarn. Let evening come. Let dew collect on the hoe abandoned in long grass. Let the stars appear, and the moon disclose her silver horn. Let the fox go back to its sandy den. Let the wind die down. Let the shed go black inside. Let evening come. To the bottle in the ditch, to the scoop in the oats, to the air in the lung, let evening come. Let it come as it will, and don't be afraid. God does not leave us comfortless, so let evening come.
That's a great little poem, Jay.
Yeah. You'd like it, Paul.
Very evocative. Yeah, I know her name. I don't really know her works.
Yeah.
I should dig into that. Jane Kenyon, let evening come, the comforts that God gives us as the light goes out.
Yeah,
that's
right.
Very nice.
No joke,
That's very nice. Well, that's a great way to start off, and let's dig right in.
Yeah.
To our poet of the movement that taught everyone apparently to look at nature and to look at the ordinary things like a bottle in a ditch in nature to express the most meaningful and lasting things. And Ozymandias does this straightforwardly. It does it ironically also, I think. And I want to dig into it. So why don't I read it first? It's a very short poem. It's a sonnet, and then we can dig right into what the poem is about, what's in it, who or what it's talking about. And then let's talk about how this is a romantic poet, how this fits into the romantic movement and emphasizes what was important to Romanticism in literature and poetry. So I'll start by reading it. Ozymandias, written in 1818 by Percy Shelley. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." All right, there it is. The 14 lines, a sonnet apparently, but with some liberties taken, I think, in the rhyme scheme, if not in other places. But let's dig into it. Jay, what's in this? What is this on the ostensibly? What is this poem?
I just want to throw out something, Paul, to humble you and I and anybody else listening. When you think of Kubla Khan and how quickly that was written, I hope you and I do a whole podcast on Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, which might be my favorite poem. It's in the top 5, written in one morning in one sitting. Allegedly, this poem was written in less than an hour on an extra page from a book he borrowed from somebody. I mean,
I didn't get that detail, really.
When we teach Frankenstein and we say you all think you're really smart, so she was 18 too, but she wrote most of this in a few weeks.
Yeah,
So
yeah, banged it out on a vacation.
being humble, humility's okay. I think Shelley, if I remember correctly, wrote a lot of lines a day. Probably maybe didn't edit enough, but he was able to produce pretty high quality stuff at a ridiculous rate.
Mm.
Yeah, I think maybe one of the early things with any group of people that are reading this to acknowledge is it's a weirdly framed tales are usually novels or longer poetic texts. You don't get framed sonnets, right?
It's weird.
Very often.
Yeah.
You have the speaker of the poem, maybe Shelley, maybe not, with the first, I'd say, 12 syllables. And then you have the meat of the poem being this antique traveler who hooks up with the poet and just launches in, sort of like the Ancient Mariner, like the Coleridge couldn't help but hear, it says, right? So you're like, I'm compelled to tell you this. And that almost seems like a romantic leitmotif, this being compelled to tell a story you have to get out.
Yeah.
And then in lines 11 and 10 to 11, you have the base of the statue has an inscription. So you have the artist, you have a variety of characters, right? You have sometimes I think I may have mentioned this in the pod before, but Billy Collins's notion that tracing how a poem moves is often more helpful than talking about what it means. So if you look at like the cinematography of this poem, it begins with two men talking, sort of at a medium range angle, and then you're in a North African desert with the two statue legs, and then suddenly a close up with the wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command of the face of the statue in the sand embedded. And then you peer in, the camera moves to the base of the statue, which says something about worldly power. Look on my works, ye mighty, in despair. And then you get a really interesting 360-degree pan shot of the lone and level sands. So I think if I were reading this with a group of people, it might be interesting to start not so much with like meaty interpretations, but what do we make of the fact that this is how the camera moves?
Yeah, I like that. I like that, like a director, like a movie director, which is most familiar art form, really, in terms of what the time we spend. But you can, you can read it that way. I like that. Those are 5 moves. I like those moves.
And then I think within each of them, you could stop and probably do more traditional English class sort of discussions. You can even ask, there's two men talking, so what stands out? And some people are going to talk, about the fact that, like, why is it antique? And that's a weird word. Why not say old? Like, so you can imagine that being a discussion, and you could talk about the statue embedded in the sand. And I noticed I like to focus on prosody with poetry because everybody has access to it equally, the rhythm and the music, and I'm a musician. And when you look at shattered visage, so the
Yeah.
face that's like the face of the statue is kind of broken and embedded in the sand, isn't it interesting that shattered visage are two trochaic feet? In other words,
Hmm.
if it's iambic pentameter all the way through, which it totally isn't, but that's the backbeat.
No. Yeah.
It's a very jazz music, this poem.
Right.
There's 140 beats in a sonnet. And
Okay.
from what I can gather, there's only 20 iambic feet in the entire poem. So what that means is way more than half of the music of the poem is discordant on
Yeah.
purpose.
That's why I said it's apparently a sonnet, but when you start digging in on the details of the sonnet, sonnets have basic rules. This poem messes with them. Plays with them.
Yeah, and it's very Shelley, not to get biographical, but that's a very Shelley trick. But I
Yeah.
find it like if you're talking about a surprising moment of brokenness, shattered visage, how cool is it, Paul, that to communicate that, he gives us the most discordant music, shattered visage. That's
Yeah.
awesome. That's
Yes.
great in my view.
Yeah, that's good on the like poetic device front. There
Yeah.
are good ones, and the line you mentioned first. That yeah, well, no, that line, yeah, shattered visage lies. That's the first line that stands out to me. It's a great
Yeah.
phrase, but then also just musically, the poetic line is broken, just like the
Yeah.
image. So even though he's messing with the form, he's using the poetic forms in the way that everybody uses poetic forms, is to
Right.
create pictures or to draw your attention. So it's doing the same thing.
I wanted just a couple more quick things. And you reminded me that we're talking about romanticism as an idea. And I would
Yes.
just put out to any teacher out there and any serious student out there that Paul's right, that romanticism is a sort of string of sort of themes and almost obsessions that this group of people cared about from the very late 1700s till these 80s. And they're strung together in some common denominator kind of ways, but each of these writers and each of these poems has their own brand of it. I would say, like, there's a bunch of different sports cars, but they're all different. That's the only car reference I'm going to make, Paul, and I'm doing it for you, just so you're clear.
I've never heard you do that. That's great.
I know. I write down the date, but I just think of, like, I think that it's really, really. I think the one thing I want to say before I pass the baton is there's a danger when reading a lot of poetry, and I would say romantic poetry specifically, but I think in general, to Hallmark card the poem. Here's what the poem says. Here's
Yeah.
the cautionary tale. Like, you can read Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and say, oh, be good to creatures great and small. So be nice to nature. Got it.
Right.
Right?
Right.
Here you could say easily, worldly power is powerful. Art is more powerful because it survives worldly power. You get the base of the statue, and then nature, the lone and level sand stretch far away, even more powerful. There's a
Right.
hierarchy of power and nature. But here's the thing, Paul. Here's what I'm always really interested in. Why wouldn't you write an essay just saying that? Why
Yeah.
not? Right?
Right.
So, what in the poem that he wrote communicates that really, really interestingly in another sort of musical moment? If it's the case that nature is most powerful,
Yeah.
isn't it interesting that that line that communicates that, the last line of the poem, is really musically beautiful, right? There's three perfect iams sitting there. The lone and level sands stretch far away is a much more musical line than almost every other line. So it's
Yeah.
almost like whether he did it on purpose or not, Shelley's saying the thing that is the most eternal is also going to sound the most harmonious, which is
Yeah.
wicked cool, right? That's really, really cool.
It's true. Yes, it's true. It's not like the lines, the alliterations of like cold command. That is
Yeah,
most of the imagery in the poem is broken. The vast trunkless legs of stone. That's that's dead and broken and
yeah.
barely there, a hand that mocked them, the heart that fed, a pedestal, lifeless things, and the evocation of a past sculptor who's long dead. All those images are of, of broken, worn, loss, emptiness.
Yeah.
Yeah, that last line is super, of that colossal wreck.
Yeah.
Great phrase, boundless and bare. And
Yeah.
then the final line, the lone and level sands stretch far away. You have
Yeah.
to believe that music was just natural to him, or I
Right.
do, to a person like Shelley. You almost can't do it on purpose. You do it in passing because you can't help but do it.
And I think there's a lot more like liquid sounds and open sounds in that last line too. And I don't want to get hyperanalytical. And I just want to say it matters to me a lot as an English teacher that students don't confuse analysis with deadening the life of a thing. If you watch a professional sports game, there's always, we've talked about this, a play-by-play person and a color analyst. And the color analyst, the play-by-play person's plot summary, and the color analyst is the literary analysis of the game. That's all
Yeah,
it is,
yeah,
right?
that's beautiful.
Yeah. So I think it isn't an accident that you have colossal wreck, right? You
Yeah,
have those hard sounds on either end. But how does it sound when nature takes over? Lone,
yeah,
level,
yeah.
sands, far, away, open at either end. All of them,
Right, right.
right?
No, that's
So it's
beautiful.
just communicating what an essay can communicate, but with this really interesting linguistic and auditory almost potency that pounds it home in a different way.
I think
That's
it's
my
exactly it.
Those are my 2 cents.
No, I think it's exactly it, and the potency is the explanation. That's the reason why. That's what when poetry does work. That's how it works. It makes you remember something that, in a way, as you said, is sort of a Hallmark card kind of teaching or takeaway, which was, don't forget, power is, all fame and fortune is fleeting, something like that.
Right.
Um, which everyone says they know, but
Exactly.
but we don't know. We're all, everyone is still seeking it and pushing for it in their own ways, and it's still held up in high esteem. And people who have it are envied. So apparently, it's not enough to just say it in a podcast or say it in an essay, but maybe poetic imagery, and an art form, as the poem itself suggests, may last longer and make a larger
Yeah.
impression than even Ramses the Second of
Right.
Egypt, who this Ozymandias is purported to be, can make, in the world.
Yeah.
Those are good. Those are good. I like that. I like
Yeah.
the first. So first of all, a way of walking through it. Walk through it and follow the camera. Look where the camera looks. Follow that as almost a plot. There's two men talking. Then we're back in time, and then
Yep.
in time there's Ozymandias. In time there's an artist also who's complimented for his skill, and then there's a final declaration of Ozymandias, the king. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair. And then there is the judgment of history, the final
Yeah.
judgment of history, which is to make a colossal wreck of everything that's there. A great irony, I think, at the center of the poem is, look on my works, ye mighty in despair.
Right. Right.
Ironically, it's true, but it's not true in the way that Ozymandias meant it. Because when you look on Ozymandias's works, which are a few broken relics,
Yep. Yeah.
that's the work of Ozymandias that we're looking on. Then
Yeah.
you do despair, not because he's so great, but because art is great, time is great, nature is great, far greater than the works of a king. So
Yeah.
that's a fun little nugget at the center of
Yeah.
the
I think
poem.
so. And I just wanted to mention too, like, just so we're clear, I don't think I said this early on. Ozymandias is the Greek name for Ramses the Second,
Yeah.
who we think could be the pharaoh from Exodus.
Right.
Possibly. But he ruled for over 50 years, a civilization that lasted 3 millennia. So this isn't, a
Right.
minor figure. So I'm interested too in, like, why not a poem called Ramses the Second? And it seems like it was inspired by an upcoming showing in museums in England of parts of a statue. So that inspired Shelley and his friend Horace Smith, who both wrote poems about
Yeah.
this.
That's right. I read that. Yeah.
You can get the Horace Smith one online, and it's just sort of stodgy and stiff. And, you can give it to a group of seniors and they could tell you in 6 minutes that, without knowing who wrote which, one of them's better than the other one.
Yeah. Which poet is the famous guy? That's
Yeah.
right. This was another competition thing, sort of like the Frankenstein writing
Yeah. Yeah.
competition. It was
Yeah.
let's write a sonnet together and see who's
Right.
see who's better. And yeah, I did read that also, that there was a statue, an ancient statue, I can't remember exactly, that was coming to England, that had been taken from somewhere.
Yeah.
That was a historical event. I think it also fits with our sort of romantic era thematic thing we pointed out, which was the strange relationship between the romantics and their classic forebears, that they're both inspired by classicism at some
Yep.
level, but we're seeking for a new way around it. So instead of writing great art that literally and directly uplifted the great antique lands and the antique rulers or great works of art like the Odyssey and the Iliad. Instead, they take them and spin them, turn them a little bit, and show a facet of them that's not seen. So instead of Ozymandias being this great king of Egypt on an Odyssey to establish a kingdom in a certain way, instead he's a person.
Yeah.
He's a person who doesn't understand his place in history exactly,
Yeah.
doesn't have perspectives. So you take him as a man, you take him as a person here. He gives you a pathway into him as a real person who's mistaken, like we are and other people we know. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so that's sort of an overlay of the
Yeah.
poem. It's vivid. It has a plot in terms of camera moves. Jay laid out five of them: two men talking. Then we're then we're back in a desert, and then we've got a couple close-ups, and then we pan back out onto the desert around, and then scene. The curtain
Yeah.
draws. Within it, the lines give nicely. If you're trying to teach sonnets, this is not a good one to teach a sonnet from, because it breaks either Petrarchan or Shakespearean sonnet rules. You see them evoked here, but they don't work in rhyme scheme or meter exactly. I think the only thing you get that's straight really is there's 14 lines, I believe. So
Yeah.
that's about it, right? I mean, the other stuff
Yeah.
doesn't work. It's evocative, but it's not
I
straightforward.
think the backbeat is still iambic, but it's sort of like the difference between traditional jazz, like a Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, versus a bebop, where a traditional jazz, the backbeat is more prominent with some rhythmic variations, whereas bebop is almost dominated by the variations. And that's
Yeah,
what I feel here. This is almost like a more
yeah,
modern jazz, because
yeah.
it is an iambic pattern, but there's just so much more variance.
Right. And they stand out, enormously. The variants take the stage. So it may be a way to wrap up a section on sonnets. It's almost
Yeah.
a it's almost a test for kids who think they're good at it. They think they have it down. And you're like, okay, now that you've got the basics worked out, or you've got it worked out what sonnets are all about, and you've read a bunch of them, try this one and see where it is sonnet like and where it's breaking. So it might be a fun way to test students on a sonnet.
Yeah.
But then on the points about it, I don't know, maybe as a way to wrap up, what is particularly romantic? What do you learn about romanticism from this poem? So if we're using it not to talk about just sonnets, but about the romantic movement, the focus, the interest, the project of romanticism, what do you think this contributes?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a couple of things. I'm thinking of, again, I do a long unit on Shakespeare's sonnets, and then I end up doing some other sonnets, and even like people are still writing them, and so it's interesting to read Shakespearean sonnets, Miltonic sonnets, Romantic sonnets, and
Yeah,
21st century ones. So from a purely like nerdy point of view, to imagine something like sonnet 18, which ends with so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this and this gives life to thee. You can hear the rhythmic sort of balance to that
yeah,
Ozymandias doesn't have, but the notion is that art is a lot more permanent than like transient things of this world, right? And it feels like Ozymandias just takes that the next step, and nature is more
yes,
permanent. So in a way, you're seeing an evolution of like an idea through sonnets. And that's sort of interesting. I think in terms of romanticism, it would be interesting to look at some Wordsworth and Coleridge poetry and this one, all of which deal with nature. But to
yeah,
say, whether it's Wordsworth daffodils or you and I have taught, so Tinternet, whatever,
yeah,
how do these people think about nature? What's similar? What's different? I mean, nature has a transcendence in romanticism that it doesn't have, say, in the Enlightenment or in the Renaissance. It's just different, right?
Right.
But
Right.
are there more than one kind of transcendence? I would argue there is. And
Yeah.
it feels to me, and again, I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't lecture on this. I would try to stage a conversation where kids can read and then write and then think and then talk. But
Yeah.
it seems that like a writer like Wordsworth has hopefulness in the power of nature
Yeah.
in its effect possibly on human beings and their behavior. And I don't know if Shelley shares that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think for Shelley, nature is as far up the hierarchy as we go. As you laid out a hierarchy, there's art and then nature. And then Wordsworth and Coleridge might go above that and say something about nature's God. There's a
Yeah.
God sort of character hovering over that, which may give them hope in in the future. As we read in the preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth was all worried about his own time and how it was deteriorating and how society and art was deteriorating, but he had some hope. With Shelley, nature is the final word. This is as far up the hierarchy as you can go, and so that is, as you say, a different way of looking at nature. And that's a great way of distinguishing approaches within Romanticism. I think most, which you also pointed out earlier, Jay, because most of what I read in textbooks and things pointed at high school classes about Romanticism, it's very one-sided and very simplistic and very monolithic too, as if they were
Yeah.
all had the same focus and the same approach.
Yep.
And they really don't. And this is a good poem for seeing nature in a completely different view. It's a dark, destructive, not the inspiration of going back to your childhood, a forest you grew up in and saw and remembered, all of the vitality of life that it brought to you. That's not the perspective of nature that's brought here. Also, it's a strange look on the ancient world. As we said with Coleridge and Wordsworth, their subject matters were always ordinary things, or tended to be ordinary things, and ordinary life and observations of a fire, going out in a fireplace, for example, in the last poem we covered. But in this poem, Shelley goes to a great character of history, a great man, which was ostensibly and generally objected or rejected by the Romantics. But he does it anyway and uses it as a way of showing something about art, something. I think it's good for building out the multifaceted nature of the Romantic movement, because he does it differently here. He does it in an unusual in an unusual way. Yeah, I think those things are good. Maybe the last thing I had down in mind to say is that the Romantics were political. I think many
Yeah.
of them were.
Very much.
Percy Shelley was, Lord Byron was incurably political, and this may have some political overtones. I think it also has some anti-religious overtones to it, as we've kind of touched on. And so if those subject matters come up in your class, and the relationship between art and politics, which I think our students are beginning to become interested in, lots of mine are, it may be a way of corralling that and making it a subject matter for class, which is a way of tricking them into reading and paying attention, which you need ways
Yeah.
of doing that. So I don't know. I'd throw that out there. As well. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. The King of Kings. You can't read that line and not think of the Gospels and think of
Right.
Jesus in the Bible. I think so. He's mushing
And
these things together.
Shelley's the most famous atheist of his
Yeah.
age. So
Right.
if
Kicked
what
out.
you're saying holds true, and I can't imagine it doesn't, it's such a wonderfully subtle dig.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Right.
None of these things we've conjured, including our conception of God, outlast how long the sand will last.
Exactly. What's the final word? The final King of
Yeah.
Kings, the sand in the desert.
Yeah. I don't know. And I think, I always am intrigued by the question, is there hope here?
Huh.
And I'm not sure what my answer is. I have to think about it more.
Yeah. The only compliment, like the one little light where you almost picture the eyebrow going up in something like hopefulness or almost humor, is that line that says that tell the sculptor well those passions read. There's a compliment to the sculptor who read well and captured perfectly what was on the, in the mind and on the face of Ozymandias.
Yep.
And that's the only place of hope I find is
That's
in
true.
the portrayal of art in the poem.
And it's even, going back to Act 5, Scene 1 of Hamlet with the gravedigger, you have a sculptor in ancient Egypt would have been property. It would have been a guy that Ozymandias
Yeah.
probably owned.
Right.
So you have like this very low class person create a sort of really interesting, thoughtful permanence over the person who's far above him.
Yes.
And that's a really interesting thing to look at in the poem, and also kind of throughout English literature. I feel that they're kind of obsessed with it from like Chaucer on, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. And for Shelley, that's where the soul persists. That's
Yeah,
where what will survive survives. It's not in the king, it's in the plumber, it's in the
yeah,
gravedigger, it's in the
right.
sculptor, of which from all the stone things we do have left over from ancient Egypt, that must have been as common a job as data entry is today, or something
Totally.
like that.
And Shelley said in his defense of poetry, poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
Yes, yeah.
And you could easily imagine him transferring that onto a sculptor in ancient Egypt. Like, you know what? Even though you don't know this guy's name and you're in your throne and he's sculpting you, his work's going to outlive yours.
Yeah.
Bottom
Yeah.
line, you know.
And almost to the, and this is another theme of Romanticism. You'll read it in all the short takes on it, the emphasis on passion. And so even in this line, often described as an emphasis, that Romanticism is described as an emphasis on passion, a movement that was interested in passion over reason, or rationality, which is a dichotomy I don't really appreciate in this
Right,
movement
right.
at all, honestly. But that in this line that we're talking about, the sneer of cold command, tell that its sculptor well those passions read. The passions do make an appearance in the poet, but it reminds me of Wordsworth in Lyrical Ballads, in which he said the poem or the poet is the person who can capture the passions in reflection after having felt them. So this sculptor is like an ideal romantic poet, as Wordsworth describes
Awesome.
him,
Yeah,
which
that's
is the
awesome.
person who experiences, who sees them, and then captures them in poetry, or in his case, in stone. And that's what the poet does: is find the vitality, the fire, the thing that drives and attracts, um, uh, and that you take pleasure in and that you enjoy. It's the passions for the romantics. It's not the only thing, but it's the thing that lasts in the end. And capturing them, that's the artist's job. And so he compliments the artist, and he compliments him for doing something I think Wordsworth would agree with, which is capturing the human passion, amidst
You
all
know,
the.
in the greatest gut punch maybe in the history of English poetry, you have the caption on the base of the statue, which is so wonderfully confident in its own power. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, you mighty in despair.
Yeah.
And then there's an end stop and a sentence that doesn't even take up a whole line. Nothing beside remains.
Yeah.
And there's no transition to that. And it is absolutely gut punch perfect.
That's really good. I hadn't thought of that.
You
I
know?
like that. Nothing besides remains. Nothing. That's what you see when you look around. That makes me think of the line, look on, you mighty in despair. Even that line, I think we tend to read that, we all read that as ourselves in a way.
Yeah.
You mighty. Our students do. They're the mighty exception to everyone, everything. They're not small. Most people don't have a sense of that. That's something I think was bequeathed to us from the Romantic movement. This sense of self, of
Yeah.
greatness of self, despite our lack of accomplishments.
Yeah.
Um, so even that Ramses is speaking to us inadvertently in the
Yeah.
poem's subtlety, but that's good. Nothing besides remains. All right, there's plenty here. Sonnet, a terse, even short poem with something that can be reduced to a Hallmark card, a Sunday school sort of closing line, but probably shouldn't be. And it
No.
may be because of the power with which a message that needs to be heard over and over again is said.
Yeah.
As we read in the Odyssey, lift the great song again. The song needs to be
Yeah.
lifted again. The muse has to say it over and over. Tell it
Yeah.
again for our time.
And speaking of which, Paul, can we end by reading it again?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
only mention that. I think this, for those of you who are teachers, I think it's really good to have the experience of reading and then reacting and then thinking and reflecting, but then going back to it to see if hearing it again feels different when it's imbued with some reflection.
Yeah. No, that's good. Jay, why don't you close us out with a reading of this?
Okay. Ozymandias. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command. Tell that its sculpture well those passions red which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
No, it still works.
Yeah,
You can still hear the beauty and the music of the broken lines even after digging into it.
yeah,
Still, that's good.
yeah.
That's good. That's a good way to close out. All right, so there it is, Percy Shelley's Ozymandias, a poem you're likely to teach in class when teaching the Romantic movement. And hopefully, you've taken some ideas for how to dig into it and ways to make it pertinent and interesting in your class and for your students. Jay, thanks
Yeah.
for opening with that Jane Kenyon poem as well. Let evening come as it must, as it will, and that was a great way to open up. All right, I think that covers it. Is that it?
Cool.
All right,
42 minutes. This is a record, folks. You have a 20-minute break. Go get coffee or a cocktail.
right. Use it in whatever way you wish. Yeah, it's all yours.
Well,
Jay, great to see you as well. Thanks
as
again.
always.
Enjoyed it enormously.